So excited today to have Emma Barden here today for best practices for STEM writing. And we're focusing specifically on abstracts, but with expansion to how you can effectively write publications and anything beyond that for this webinar. I am going to go ahead and briefly introduce Emma Barden, who is here with us today. She's working on her MBA, almost there. I wanted to give her that little bit of boost there. So Emma today is the founder of Barden Consulting, and her works with a variety of clients in biotech and healthcare. She earned her master's in rhetoric and writing from San Diego State and her bachelor's in literary journalism from UCI. Emma is a writer in many forms, and that includes being a consultant, a science writer, technical writer, copywriter, and editor. She has fully immersed herself in writing. She has partnered with many labs as well as companies in the US as well as in Europe. Emma leverages her near decade of experiences in past projects, including press releases, abstracts, investor slide decks, grant proposals, just to list a few of the many communications that she has done for biotech, medtech, pharma companies, etc. My emphasis here is that whoever works and looks at Emma's work, it has to be sort of ready to go and to the public eye. And she has an excellent skill and expertise with that today. And so we're excited to have Emma. And with that, I am going to go ahead and hand it off to you.
Wonderful. So, and how do I minimize? There we go. That way you don't have to look at yourselves. Although I suppose I'll keep it closed like that so it's not in the way. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending the workshop today. We are going to focus today on best practices for STEM writing. The goal at the end of today's workshop is for each of you to feel an increased confidence in your own writing, to feel like you have some really pragmatic tips and strategies to not only build the confidence in your writing, but to overcome writer's block, because that happens to everybody. But it can either be a moment or it can be a day, week, month-long endeavor. So hopefully to cut it down to just a hesitancy of a moment of, oh wait, I have resources for this, and then to be able to not even be impacted by writer's block. And then as well, we'll end with some tips for strategically making good writing every time, regardless of what the type of writing is, whether it's an abstract for a conference or a publication for a peer-reviewed scientific journal, or an investor slide deck, or any kind of writing for your PI. The goal is that you'd have a lot of confidence and feel like you're resourced to be able to do that well and effectively every time. So going to our next slide here. This will be kind of the layout for today. I'll give a brief introduction about me. I'm going to make that very short since Joanne did such a good job of that. We'll start with gaining confidence in your own writing, then the writer's block component, and then we'll go into some good science writing. If any of you are more math-minded, you'll be excited to learn that there is a formula that you can adjust no matter what kind of writing you're doing that will work, which I will teach you today, and hopefully you'll be able to practice and recommend in your own writing. And then we will have time for you to workshop your abstract today. So although we're workshopping abstracts, this writing that we're doing today and the skills we're talking about are applicable for any kind of scientific writing, and actually beyond science as well. And we'll end with a Q&A, so you can ask any questions that you might have. I do have some page references in the presentation. You can feel free to make note of them if you end up borrowing the book from the library, or if you are raffled a copy, where you can look up additional resources that partner with what we're talking about today. So a little bit about me, and I won't cover the same material, so I'm just going to jump into what I'm doing today. But I'm essentially a writer, a teacher of writing turned science writer. So a lot of my experience has been in tutoring other people on how to do good writing themselves. And at this point, just doing the writing for science companies. So they're offloading it to me and I'm producing a turnkey solution for them. One of the main strategies that I use is this formula for good science writing that I'm going to teach you today. So you'll be able to leverage that in your own writing. And at the bottom, I have some examples of companies who I've done work for. Metabolon is a metabolomics company in San Diego. ScreenTech Oy, you can see at the bottom right, that's a Finnish company. That's one of the European companies I've worked with. You can just see a few that are on here, but it's throughout the life sciences, everything from genomics to DNA to different technologies to AI pathology. I've written all of it. So today we are going to start where I would like you to think about your own writing practice, whatever that means for you thus far in your writing career. And I'd like you to think about what, as an icebreaker, and we're going to actually utilize the chat on the right-hand side of our call today for you to be able to answer. Hopefully that pops up here. If not, I'll do some text sourcing here while you're coming up with your answers. But I'd like to start with you thinking about, in your own writing, what do you currently do to build your own confidence? That might look like, maybe you write emails every day and you talk about your research in that. Maybe it's more intentional and something like a journal where you're writing a few sentences on what research you accomplished that day, or perhaps something that you learned in your class. But I'd like you to think about, if you're still in the class component of your PhD, and I'd like you to think about what you do. It doesn't have to be daily, but what do you do consistently to build your confidence in your writing and to practice your writing? So I'm going to go ahead and give a moment for everyone to fill out and populate that chat box on the right. And Joanne, if you maybe do the first one just to say tester so I can see if it pulls up on my screen, that would be great. Oh, here it is. Excellent. Thank you. Yes, excellent. Okay, we have word dumping on here, outlining, let it sit overnight before reviewing. That's a great one. Another feature that I can recommend too, if you are emailing something out, is a scheduled send. So if you are going to be sharing about your research, letting it sit overnight and scheduling it, but then you can go back to it. So you hit send and you can think about it and think of how you feel after it's sent. Ooh, outlining is a great one. Love that. Really, really useful. Rewriting meeting notes, that is fabulous. A great way to make sure that you're really absorbing what you've learned. Absolutely. The weekly write-up for PIs, essential. I know that's for the PI and a requirement. It can also be so helpful for your own practice. Summary for the PI, absolutely. Of course, this is a key part of PhD research, is that talking with the PI. We'll talk today about how to tailor what you're saying for when you're talking to different people, whether it's your PI, who of course is going to have an intimate knowledge of what you're studying, but also if you were talking to an investor or a scientist in another field, perhaps somebody who doesn't have that, that inside knowledge on what you're studying. We'll talk about how to tailor writing for them as well. Reading is a great way to learn about how to do good writing. We'll talk about that today as well. We're going to discuss a little bit, not a little bit at length, how to leverage domain specific vocabulary, and reading is a great way to find those domain specific phrases and words. Whoever wrote word vomiting, Serena, I feel you. I used to call the first drafts vomit drafts, because you're literally getting it from up here onto the page, and it feels a little bit like word vomit, and it's great. So that's if you want a clever, funny way to say it, it's a nice way to kind of lighten the load. Writing scripts for talks is a really good one, and really thinking through what you're going to say. Reading other papers, again, this feeds into that domain specific vocabulary we'll get to. And reviewing other people's writing, this is a good one. So you're already all doing some really great things to help your own writing. And I'm just going to scroll through to make sure, hopefully this gives you some ideas too, of like, oh, I could also do that. These are different than some of the things I'm going to be recommending. So it's a really nice thing that you can add to your list today. Bullet point outline is a great idea too. Proofreading, yes, really feeling confident that you know what you're saying and you have agency over it. Excellent. So let me go ahead and wonder if I can drag this to the side. There we go. All right. So here are some tips that I'm going to share with you for gaining confidence in your own writing. The first thing is, whenever you are unsure of how to share what you're writing, there's a formula that you can fall back to. We're going to get that in the second half of our presentation today, but I'm highlighting it because it's so easily leveraged for any kind of writing indication. So I definitely want you to remember that there's going to be a formula and you can come back to it. The second point here is getting towards what the formula will ask us about, but here's the main idea. If you take one thing away from this workshop, it comes back to this, which is frame your research right from the start in terms of what unmet need it addresses and why that matters. So thinking about your own research, and we'll really get into an exercise on this in a moment, just think for a minute and I'll pause. What is your current research project, and what problem in healthcare and science in the world is your finding that you're hoping to discover? What will it address? And why does that matter? I'm going to pick on microfluidics a little bit just because I have some inside knowledge with that one. But for example, maybe you're working on a device that could engineer 1 million droplets a minute, whereas previously it could only make 100 or 10,000. But that million a minute is really the tipping point for being able to commercialize the product and bring it to market. That's a huge win. So I would think not just in terms of saying what we're discovering this million a minute, but why it matters. So think for a moment about your own writing. I'm going to pause so you can do that. Maybe jot down a note because we're going to come back to it. So I'm going to give you a second to do that. Not just the finding, but also why it matters. So like, what is the implication of that? Just one moment on that, and then we'll move on. Okay. So hopefully you got something written down. I will give you more time to workshop this in a moment, but while we were talking about it and the juices were flowing, I wanted you to write it down. So another thing that you can do to build confidence in your writing is leveraging domain-specific vocabulary. So I'm sure in your own writing, especially if you've done reading, those of you who mentioned like reading other people's writing or abstracts or reading other articles, you'll notice there are phrases that consistently show up. And I'll pick again on microfluidics and use that as an example. If there is a tumor and you're trying to block off the blood supply to the tumor, the phrase that they would use is the intentional occlusion of a vessel. And all that means is blocking off the blood supply on purpose to a tumor so the tumor starves and dies. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's useful. And of course, the writing would need to potentially explain that, but that phrase is commonly used among domain specialists or even within publications. And so one of the things we'll talk about today is how to find out what domain-specific vocabulary is, but it can be really useful for you to feel and sound like an expert, and it will build your credibility as a writer and help for a variety of indications, whether this is for a publication in a peer-reviewed journal or even at a conference when you're talking with someone, depending on their background, knowing how to leverage certain words and when to appropriate them in a really profound way. So we'll talk about that later today as well. Someone else already mentioned this, so I wrote it here as well, just in case, which is revise multiple drafts. You don't want to turn in that first vomit draft. And hopefully at the end of today, your first draft is vastly improved because you have a framework to go back to and a formula. But again, make sure that you have time to review several drafts before you turn it in. And this leads well into the next suggestion I have for confidence in your writing, which is have other people look at it who are trusted and who can give reliable, supportive advice. For example, and in particular, I'm recommending your PI. They'll probably look at it more near the end, but if you do have a weekly meeting, you could utilize that to get some feedback on perhaps phrases or things of that nature. And then other researchers in your lab, maybe somebody else, maybe a predecessor began a project and you could ask them to look over how you're writing about this. But it's always a good idea to have somebody else look over your writing and to get that extra kind of feedback. They might even have an article to add to your lit review, or as I mentioned, phrasing that you hadn't thought about that you could leverage. And then the other thing that I'd recommend in terms of confidence is there is an inherent risk in writing, which is we have to show it to somebody at some point and risk them not loving it. But that's the only way to get it published is to hit that submit button, to turn it in, to apply for that conference, to send the email. So at the end of the day, there's a little bit of Nike here and that idea of you at some point, you just got to do it. But hopefully coming back to these tools on the front end will be kind of a good starting place where you can feel really confident in what you're turning in. So regardless of the feedback, you at least are confident that this is the best version of what you want to say so far. I'm going to pause here before we go on. Are there any questions or comments about this? Yeah, I love this. You can't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. Yes, you cannot win the lottery without buying a ticket. So that's so true. And love this idea of UCI's Writing Center having one-on-ones. Definitely leverage that. That can be a really great resource. Any other comments or questions? And it's okay if not, but I would like to pause to offer it. Okay. So overcoming writer's block. This is one of my favorite strategies we're going to practice today for overcoming writer's block. I've used it time and again, and there's really
Emma, sorry, there was a question about the domain specific vocabulary in the chat.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Let me go back to this. How is leveraging domain specific vocabulary versus unnecessary? Great question. The answer to this, and we'll get into more details later, but I'd like to address it at least a little bit now, is it depends on your audience. So if you're talking with your PI, and I'm going to speak in generalities right now, but if you're talking with your PI, there probably isn't unnecessary jargon because they know all the domain specific phrases. So for them, they're like, yes, I know all the things that you're saying. If you're talking to somebody else, it depends who they are in terms of what's going to be unnecessary and what is supportive. So it will require you to think about, who am I addressing here? If it's a publication, say you're trying to publish in biomicrofluidics or in Lab on a Chip. Again, I'm picking on the microfluidic people here. If you're in microfluidics, yay, this is helpful in particular. But you would think about, who is the readership? Who actually reads Lab on a Chip? What do they know? What is specific to them? What are they going to have no idea and it's like too niche? What is actually helpful and supportive? And one way to do this, again, we'll come back to this at length later on, but just to give a little snip here, is to look at current articles that have been published in that publication and look for, what are the common domain specific vocabulary phrases that come up time and again, regardless of if an indication is for cancer or if the indication is for Alzheimer's disease research. What are the phrases that keep showing up when we talk about microfluidics in this publication? And appropriating those in your own writing. At something like a medical device conference, it's probably going to be a wider audience and they might not have that same specificness. So as the audience becomes less specialized in your area, your domain specific vocabulary will decrease, or you'll need more supportive phrasing around it where they can figure out what that phrase means, even if they've never heard it before, based on the other things that you say after it. So does that answer the question? And you can respond in the chat if that's helpful at the moment. All right, we'll move beyond for now and feel free to ask if you have a follow-up question on that, but we will get to that. Oh, perfect, there. Okay, great, thanks, Mara. So for overcoming writer's block, for overcoming writer's block, here are my two tried and true recommended across application areas for filling it. For the science one, across areas, it's fill in the formula. And as I mentioned, we're going to get to that, but keep coming back to the formula because as long as you're plugging in the variables, that will be really supportive. Let me read Joanne's. When you're working on, yes, this is a great resource, Joanne. Exactly. When you're doing that background lit review research, notice what phrases show up time and again and really mine it for those domain specific phrases that are expected from a given publication. Absolutely. Even, and in particular, I would recommend looking at past publications out of your own lab. So whatever lab you're in, see what maybe your predecessor, of course, they had a few publications that they graduated, what phrases showed up over and over again in theirs that you could then also include in yours, and where were they published? And you can do kind of a cross-reference of that. Here's my favorite strategy for writer's block. It's using voice to text. Most phones will have a feature for that. Some computers have a feature for that as well. Don't pay for anything. There's free ones. I have two on here, the logos for them so you can see. Here at the bottom is a link for it. And I'm going to pause here in a moment. But what I would like you to do right now is please get out your phone and open up. Hopefully you've had a chance prior to the workshop today to download one of these. If you haven't, you can go ahead and use this link at the bottom, the speech texter. But please go ahead and go to this and open it up. And what I'd like you to do, and I'm going to give you a minute to do this. I'll actually give you 2 minutes on the clock here. What I would like you to do is to just, for the 2 minutes, and I'll say start in a second, talk into your device, whichever platform you've chosen to use is fine, using voice to text, and just talk about your research. What are you trying to find and why does that matter? So what are you trying to find and why does it matter? I'm going to go ahead and give you 2 minutes on the clock now. And if anyone has questions, you can write it into the chat box. I'll look at that. Go ahead and start now. If you haven't started talking about the implications of your research or why it matters, do that now. So if you're still in the explaining a million bubbles a minute and how great is that, at this point, start speaking into the device. Why is a million a minute helpful? Or whatever you're finding, what can we now do with research as a result of that? I'll go ahead and give you about 45 more seconds to do that. All right, and go ahead and bring it to a close. Make sure you hit save so you don't lose that component. And I have a resource here on the bottom. I'm also giving homework. Remember, I used to be a college professor turned high school English teacher with a science writing unit. So I'm going to give you homework, but I do recommend it, which is to train. If it was voice to text, excellent. You can also do voice record. So if your current recording was just audio, tonight your homework is to transcribe it. And you can use this resource. I have it here at the bottom, rev.com. You have to pay for those ones. It's not a ton. And I will say it's not great. There's two versions of it. One is a more affordable economic. I leverage this a lot for clients where it will do like an auto that uses AI to auto transcribe from audio to text. It's not great unless you have an American accent or really an American accent, but they do have a more intense feature where somebody personally will transcribe it that you could use if you want. And that is better with accents. At that point, you can decide if it's worth it or not for you. The way around this, of course, is voice to text, not just the audio recording. But this one up here that I have the image of is just the audio. So if you use that, you could transcribe it tonight. This is a really great resource if you're stuck. Rather than trying to rate anything, just do it based on what you're hearing. Excellent. Okay, great. Word also has one. Great resource. Thanks, Sydney, for sharing that. Yes. So there's a lot of different platforms you can use, but the important thing is that you find one you like and you use it. So this is a really, really lovely resource. You don't need to talk for an hour recording it, but even just 5-10 minutes, because for example, right now, you already don't have a blank page. In fact, you have 2 minutes worth of content that you could move around depending on what you're trying to create. And we'll use a formula in a little bit and you'll already be able to pull from that. So this is a really great first step that across industries seems to work really well. So try it out. You'll have to, at the end, let me know what you think about this if you've gotten a chance to use it beyond our workshop. So other strategies to overcome writer's block. Here are some of them. One, have a friend write down what you say. So if having the phone in front of you, if in the last 2 minutes you're like, oh my gosh, I could not perform. I had performance anxiety. It was overwhelming. It was too much. This could be a really good option. The friend could be somebody in your lab. It could also be somebody outside of your lab, but ask them to write down verbatim what you're saying, because then it is your words, right? This is just kind of taking out the middleman, but that might feel more comfortable. You could also have them ask you in a question and answer format some questions about your research. As I mentioned, we're going to get to a formula, so they could ask you questions about those variables in your formula, for instance, to be really proactive and helpful at this. Another tip I have is to start with the literature review. So maybe out of your PI's lab, there should already be publications, and you could look through those publications through the lit review to see what are other people in your lab doing, and that can kind of help get the juices flowing on like, what am I doing exactly? And also, what's the application? Why does this matter? So if you're getting stuck on that component, this can be a really great option, especially if you're noting what's different about what you're doing and try to write in like a sentence about what uniquely you're contributing to the field. That can be a great way in just this bite-sized one sentence thing to overcome writer's block. So it's not a huge text that you're trying to write, but just one sentence. The other recommendation, and someone had mentioned this or variation of this in the opening icebreaker, was set a timer for 5 minutes and brain vomit, like journal free write, just stream of consciousness. What are you researching? Why does it matter? Don't worry about spelling, structure, none of that, just write. And in fact, if English is your second language, you could also do this in your native language. If you're really, right, the idea is to be successful at whatever step you're doing. So if you're like, Emma, I don't think I could even do 5 minutes on my research in English, it feels too much right now, then break it down and do it in your native language. And we'll, of course, if we're publishing at an English venue, we'll have to translate that later. But for this initial step, that initial getting over the blockage part, you could always do it in your native language. It doesn't have to be pretty, remember, it just has to get written. And then at the bottom here, I do have another suggestion for a page reference. Page 72 has some additional ideas of the text that we're auctioning off. So you could always look there as well for some additional ideas on writer's block.
Yeah, just to give you a sense of what she talks about in that page 72 and 73, she has this idea of ninja writing, which is just, you might not even have 20 minutes, you might have 5 minutes. And we all have busy days. If you could just make sure that you put out something every day or a couple times a day when you have 5 minutes, things come together and you overcome writer's block.
Yes, exactly. And thank you for sharing that. Are there any questions about these strategies before we move on? All right, we'll go ahead and go to the next part here. So, and I jumped the gun a little bit on this, but if you're an ESL writer, first of all, good for you. It is so difficult to write content in not your first language, and then to do that about scientific writing. So some resources and tools that you can do for writer's block if English isn't your first language. By the way, English is not my first language either. My first language is Swiss German. Now, I'm not a specialist enough in that to talk about writing any kind of science writing in Swiss German, but that is my first language. So I do understand trying to come up with words in a second language and how to do that. So my recommendation here is do the above mentioned strategies if you need to in your native language. That's okay, just to get your ideas on paper and kind of make this the path of least resistance. So if you're able to do that brain dump or that 5-minute free write in your, in English, great. If it needs to be in your native language, totally fine. The other tip that I really offer to ESL writers is this domain specific vocabulary, which we talked a little bit about and we'll get to later on in the presentation. It can be so helpful for sounding like this isn't your second language and really being able to appropriate it in a way that builds your credibility as a writer and as a specialist in the field, because you are. And mining those past articles out of your lab or in the publication that you're hoping to publish in, or wherever you're submitting. Maybe it's for a conference and looking at like past accepted abstracts or things of that nature, maybe past people from your lab who've successfully been granted presentation opportunities at a conference, looking through their writing and seeing what phrases you can use. That can be very supportive. Does anyone else have either, if they are non-native English speaker, but if anybody else has suggestions, I'd love for you to drop them in the chat for if you're open to sharing, if there's something that you do that works for you. I'll give a moment for that or for people to ask questions. All right, let's go ahead and go. But if anyone types in, here we go. Thesaurus synonym is my best friend when writing. Yes, thesaurus synonym is great. Maybe there's another way to phrase something. This can be a really good resource. Oh, I love this. Talking to myself during my commute. Hi, Allison, by the way, it's nice to see you on here. That's awesome. Yes, saying it out loud to yourself, talking about what you're learning. Absolutely. These are great, great resources. Awesome. All right, additional strategies for writer's block. I'd like for you to think about, beyond ESL students at this point, going back to the whole group, this is an exercise and we'll use the chat for this. What is a strategy that you already successfully have used to overcome writer's block? Maybe it doesn't work every time, but something that's helpful for you when you're stuck. Or if you're like, Emma, that's why I'm in this workshop, I have no strategies, please help me, or what's one from this list that you're going to try first? So let's go ahead and just see what people are saying in the box here. My personal favorite, by the way, is the formula. I'm coming back to that. Ooh, mind mapping. Excellent. Side note, for those of you who have the book, that or are going to end up with the book, there's a whole section in that book about how to do mind mapping effectively to help, and some really practical small steps that you can take to, and then at the end you have a really comprehensive mind map. So if you're like, ooh, that sounds interesting, how do I do that? The book has some really great options on it. Bullet pointing ideas. Yeah, absolutely. Breaking it down so you're not writing this big thing. You have these small bullets. Outlining. Oh, absolutely. That's great. So you kind of know where you're going and you have a roadmap. Yes. Love this. Working on easier parts of the article to get the ball rolling. 100%. If it's an article for a peer-reviewed scientific journal, by the way, maybe the first thing you write is the methods, because you know what you did, right? You already did it. So starting there can be helpful if the introduction feels a little too much to start off with, although hopefully this formula we're going to talk about will be helpful. Background section, finding published one that you like, and then rewriting the first sentence or two in your own words. Absolutely. This is a great way to do it, right? Lit reviews out of your lab previously, or that have been published in the place that you're looking for, or accepted wherever you're looking to send your writing. That could be a really great opportunity. The lit review, excellent. Okay, so you're really gonna like the formula, because it comes back to this lit review idea. Citation threads, yes, this is a great resource. Breaking down the paper into questions to be answered, love this. This actually feeds in really well to the formula idea that we're going to talk about in a minute, where you can just go, what is my variable A, and solve for it. So that will, those of you who are interested in trying this or have tried it, you're going to like the formula part. The word vomit, yes, I know. Oh my gosh. Okay, fellow perfectionist here. I have a really hard time writing anything that I wouldn't want to publish. Part of it is you just got to do it. You don't have to show it to anybody, right? Nobody who hires you is going to say, can I please see a first draft of something? And if they do, your comeback line can be, after you show me your first draft of something, because nobody's first drafts are good. Everybody needs to iterate a few times. So these are great, great resources. I hope that you're able to leverage to this voice to text one and see how that is supportive if you're really getting stuck. So anyway, this bottom part here, when your message isn't clear, you can get blocked. That's not a myth or an excuse. For this one, the context was not particularly about science writing, but I wanted to include it because this is an interesting idea of having a clear message and that helping the writing to flow and getting through writer's block, because we are going to now be moving into that formula component. And the idea is, if you're ever stuck, and the person who mentioned solving for different variables in the writing, this plays in really well to it and dovetails. So let's go ahead and step into that now. All right, good science writing. There is the formula. And of course, it'll get adjusted based on your audience and what you're writing. But this is a really good framework to use. And we started this a little in the beginning. I'm going to give you a moment now that we've kind of been percolating a little, think of it again. But the idea is this: you want to frame your research or your current project, whatever it is, in terms of what unmet need in the industry you're finding addresses and why that matters. So if you were able to create droplets that are a certain size, why is that size in particular useful? Maybe your device that you've engineered makes them uniform and they're this particular size. The finding is the size and how many you can make. Why it matters is the second part, and you want to include both. One, what you found; two, why it matters. Maybe why it matters is that size is small enough we could inject it into the bloodstream without killing somebody, right? It's small enough it could flow safely, for example. So coming back to this idea of what did you find and why does it matter? That framework of having both parts together is going to help give you confidence, because you're going to know what you do, be able to talk about it clearly, but also be able to say why it matters. And that'll help with overcoming some of this writer's block. There is an actual formula with like variables for those of you who are mathy and are like, this is not a formula, and I want the actual formula. We're getting to it. But I want to start off with this idea, and I'm going to give you 1 minute on the clock to write a sentence right now. And if you're like, I don't want to write it, I'm going to do the voice to text, totally fine. But I'm going to give you a minute to, in writing somehow, write down and if you're doing a few projects, just pick one of them, but maybe the one closest to publication. What did you find and why does it matter? So go ahead and start that now. Okay, go ahead and wrap up that sentence. If as you were writing that, you had some of that hesitancy of, I want it to be perfect. How do I write it perfect? If that happens, the strategy I'd recommend that you leverage is then don't write it. Do the voice to text or even just an audio note, because we care less about what we're saying. Like it's a little easier to overcome. Was that sentence grammatically correct? Was it a complete thought? Was it a run-on? It can be easier to do it as voice to text rather than trying to write it down. So you can always use that as kind of a scaffolding if you need. So we're going to move on to our next exercise, which is we're going to use what you just wrote down. So don't get rid of it. Here's the idea between good writing and better writing. And we're going to look at two examples. We're going to use the chat here for an answer. But the question is going to be, which do you think, these are about the same thing, but which example A or example B, which one do you feel is better? And by better, I mean more effective, and why? Let's say, since you're like, well, it depends on the venue, publication in a peer-reviewed scientific journal or an abstract at a conference. The answer will work for both. Which one do you think is better and why? So I'm going to give you a minute to read through both, and you can write in the chat what you think. A lot of answer B's coming in here for easier to understand. So great comment on that. Great comment that we need to understand the application. I will challenge you a little bit on this one. For an article in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, there will likely be other statements. It won't be a standalone sentence. And does that change your answer and why? It won't just be this sentence on its own. Imagine if it was part of an abstract or part of the article itself. So yes, so answer, and I think some of these are rolling in where they're similar. So B is better, it seems too wordy. A is a little confusing for someone who's not a specialist, etc. And then we have down here at the bottom, A seems to have more domain specific vocab. That's what I want to latch onto, and it'll segue in a little bit to who our audience is. So if you are presenting to, say, an investor, yes, B could be the better option because they likely are not a scientist and have, unless they've founded a company in this specific area, probably have zero idea about it. But otherwise, A, because it gives details that are helpful in terms of why this finding matters. So for example, if you were to say sentence B to somebody else who studies microfluidics, they might ask like, well, how are you treating cancer though? I don't understand the mechanism of how this works, or what kind of cancer, or exactly. Oh, and this is a great question too at the end here that someone just wrote in. I love this. Where is this sentence placed? Abstract or the body of the paper? Great question. So where I'm going with this, and I'm really glad for the discussion on the side here, is it matters. It matters who's reading it, and it matters where it's going. How much of that domain specific vocabulary you should be leveraging. So ideally, you're talking about two components here. You want to say what you found and why it matters. With example B, it does sort of do that. It says that we made, it says, oh my goodness, let me go back here. Oh, and now I've really gone to the end. There we go. With example B, it does say that we made a device and that we found we can make 1 million a minute, and that it helps for cancer. And that might be enough depending on the venue. With example A, notice we're having some of these phrases like intentionally occluding a cancerous vessel. So not just the intentional occlusion of a vessel, but what kind? Cancer vessels. How are we going to do it? We're going to block off the blood supply. So if it was an article for publication in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, likely example A would be better. If it was an investor slide deck, probably example B. The point of all of this is it's important to have both of those. What did you find and why does it matter? And then how specific we get depends on your audience. So let's look at the formula that we're going to use moving forward. And I'm going to move the chat part over here. So this is my formula. I use this for everything. Literally all of the clients on that first page where it said about Emma Barden, I use this for every single thing I write for them. These are the questions I ask when I'm interviewing CEOs and founders. And for those of you who've already published somewhere in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, you're going to be like, sounds a lot like a condensed version of the introduction. Yes, it does. And it works for everything. So here's the order. The first thing is, what is at stake? Why does this area matter? And I'm going to give you an example that I did for a client just to give you some examples of this in a second, but let's go over it first and then I'll get the plug in. So what's at stake? What is currently done? As a side note, what's currently done, if you're doing publication of peer-reviewed scientific journal, the what's currently done would mean what has been published about this? Like, what are other people doing? If this was for a company, it would be who are the competitors in this space and like, what is the current standard of care up until now? So that's the second part. Third part is what's missing. So what's wrong with what is currently done? Like, why is there a pain point? What is the pain point of what's currently being done? And I have a reference down here to page 113 of Sarneca's for coming up with like what that gap is. So if you end up with the book, you can look at that part. The fourth component is how does what you found address that unmet need? Because now we understand the relevance of what you found. And then this all should add up to what can now happen because you found that. So what's the implication of your finding? I'm going to give you an example of this. I'll pick on Metabolon so we can make it really concrete. There was an article published in a peer-reviewed journal where their technology was used in it, and they wanted to write a case study. Very scientific. It was for other PhDs. They wanted me to use a lot of domain-specific vocabulary. Since I don't know how much all of you know about metabolomics, I'm going to make it a little more general than the writing I did for them, but I want to show you how I would apply this formula. My first question would be, what's at stake? Well, what was at stake is there were pediatrics, so children, patients who had cancer, and there is a section of them where when you give them chemotherapy, it does not work. Their cells spit out the chemotherapy. What's currently done? So part B, what's currently done? Well, for children who have that, we have to treat them with different treatments and they're not as effective. There's not something that works as well as chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is the standard of care. So really what's currently done is they try chemo anyway, and it doesn't work for this group of patients. So what's missing? What is the gap? Well, we don't have a viable treatment at the moment to help these pediatric patients who are treatment resistant for leukemia, for chemotherapy for their leukemia. How does what you found address this unmet need? Well, this company had a product that could analyze at a cellular level what was happening for those patients. And they found, oh, pediatric patients who are chemo resistant, it's because there's this one enzyme, and they had a name for the enzyme, where every time if they have this enzyme in their cell, every time you feed in chemo, that cell spits it right back out because that enzyme spits it right back out. And So what they found was if we feed those patients an enzyme inhibitor, that enzyme can't work, and then the chemo can go in and stay in. That's what they found. So by using this formula, we understand why it's relevant. If out the gate, I just went what they found, I'd say, hey, they found a great enzyme inhibitor. And you'd be like, great, why does that matter? So using this formula can be really helpful for being able to create interest and drive and impact with your writing, and ultimately to make it successful. For those of you who've published, you're probably, as I mentioned, you go, this looks a lot like an article intro, and it does. If you were writing an article for publication in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, what's at stake is usually your first paragraph. It's why does this topic matter? What's currently done is your lit review. That's usually a few paragraphs. What's missing? This is usually the third or fourth paragraph of your intro. And how does what you found address that unmet need? That's the fourth part. If you're writing an article abstract, all 5 of these things put together is the abstract. It's what's at stake, what's currently done. Of course, you're not doing a full lit review, but you're in broad strokes saying what happened. You're saying the gap, you're saying what you found and why it matters and what can now be done. So it just, how long you make each of these parts indicates whether it's the abstract or the article itself. If you were at a conference, all this stuff is going to go on your 3-panel poster presentation, and you'll be sharing that with everyone who comes up to your booth. Really what's changing is how long is each section that you're talking about, and how much domain specific vocab are you going to be using when you're talking about it. I'll also say I've done a lot of investor slide deck support for startup companies. This is also the formula that the successful ones use when pitching to an investor, except of course there's financials and things of that nature also in here. I'd like to go ahead and pause because that was a ton that I just threw at you. And I'd like to give you a minute to ask any questions, or if you'd like clarification on any of this, and you can go ahead and use the chat for that. Okay, I'll leave the chat open if there's any follow-up questions. Oh, here we go.
Oh, just me marking the time, just letting you know at the top of the hour.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm also keeping track, so we should be good here. And do we have till 30 after or 20 after?
Ideally 20, so there's a couple more minutes I can do announcements, but if we don't have time for that, take it to the end.
Not a problem. We can absolutely do 20 after. That sounds good. Okay, great question here. So so this is a paper-wide or abstract-wide formula, correct? Not within paragraphs. Correct, unless what you're writing is shorter. So in general, an abstract is going to have all these things in it because the abstract should just be 1 paragraph. They're pretty short. It's get in, get out. It's maybe a sentence or 2 on each of these things. Probably a couple sentences on what you found, and then a couple sentences on the implications, but it's still very short. For an article in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, probably each of these things is at least a paragraph. The what you found is going to be the whole results section, so it'll be longer. But no, we're not talking within a particular paragraph, unless you only had a paragraph to apply to a conference. If their application is short, then all these would go in that 1 paragraph. So it depends is the answer to that. Hopefully, Marina, let me know if you have follow-ups on that. If this is the abstract for the formula for the abstract. Great question on the repetitive thing. So here's the deal. A lot of times the sentences used in the abstract can be actual sentences in the paper or very close. The abstract is not like a book jacket. You know, if you're reading a book, you want to be surprised, right? You need enough to entice you, but you don't want the ending spoiled. Abstracts are not like that. Abstracts are spilling the beans. They're saying, this is exactly the topic, what was done, what was missing, what we found. Here's exactly what we found. Here's why it matters. A lot of times researchers will read that and then decide, do I want to read the whole thing then or not? And if they want, that's how they'll decide. So it is going to, by nature, be repetitive. It should be. That's how you know, in that case of an abstract to the paper itself, that you're doing it right. It should repeat itself, but at length in the paper itself. For example, the abstract is not going to quote past, cite by name previous studies. The article itself would expand and have those actual citations. Great question. Okay, any follow-ups? Okay, good. All right, you guys, I'm going to give you 3 minutes for you to fill in this formula for yourself. So what's at stake? What's the current protocol or industry standard? Basically, like, why are you doing this? What was done before, and how is what you're doing different? So what was done before? What's the problem with what's done before? How does what you do begin to address that gap? Maybe you're not filling it all the way, but you're doing part of it. And then the implications, what can we do now? So I'm going to go ahead and give you 3 minutes on the clock. Please go ahead and do that. You can do it as voice to text, or you can handwrite it. Either one is fine. Go ahead and start now, and write questions if you have any in the chat box. You have about 45 more seconds. And there's a question I'll respond to that. Navjop, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing your name correctly, but I wrote in the box an answer to your question. All right, and go ahead and wrap up the sentence that you're completing right now. All right, I did want to bring this up. There was a question in the comments that said, what tense is generally advisable? And I gave some examples here of phrasing that's often used, which is previous standards for whatever it is, include, and then saying it. So it's current present tense, right? It's what's currently done. Current protocols include ... Previous studies addressed Y by Z. Yes, it depends. Exactly. It depends on what you're addressing. So if it's something that was historically done, you could use past tense. Pardon me, my dog is shaking in the background. But often it's present tense. It's what's done in the field right now. What's the standard? What is unmet with that? Typically, you're not doing such a deep dive of the past that you need past tense. All right, so hopefully you have the start at least for filling in this formula. If you have not, or like say there's parts of these that are missing, make a note tonight to spend a minute on each, writing it down or doing voice to text. All right, domain specific vocabulary. So we touched on this a little bit, but I want to do a deep dive. So the idea with domain specific vocabulary is it's worth using as long as it's known by your intended audience. So we can't really just copy and paste. Oops, David, you have a question. Go ahead.
It's more of a comment. I think, some of the students in the chat have asked, is this formula really applicable to larger pieces of a paper? I think of the results section, if you can just go back 2 slides or 1 slide. Oops.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, my phone is ringing. I'm just gonna hang up. If you think of the last 3 points here as an iterative process in the results section of your paper, it's not so like the problem of the current protocol. It's the question you're addressing for that section of the paper, how your research fills that, and then a transition to what's next in the paper. So that's just one way to think about how to apply parts of this formula to a larger piece of a scientific paper.
Yes, so that would be in addition to what I was recommending. That would be another option. Absolutely. Are there any additional comments or questions on that? Thank you, David. Appreciate that. Okay. Here we go. So for domain specific vocabulary, the question is really to think about who is your audience, and how much is too much. It's a balance where you want to show that you know your material. And if you don't use any domain specific vocabulary, that can hurt you if you're, for example, looking to publish in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, or maybe even at a conference, if the person who comes up is a specialist. So being able to adjust how you talk about things is really helpful. But you don't want, of course, too much, or as someone already noted, it could alienate your audience. So part of this is being, if you're doing it verbally with someone, say you're at a networking event, being able to adjust when you go, oh, you're a microfluidics specialist as well. Well, in that case, and then segueing. If it's something like a poster presentation, there can be some domain specific phrasing on there, there should be, but giving supportive enough phrases around it that we understand what the phrase means can be very helpful. So for example, if we use the phrase intentionally occluding a vessel, we could say, maybe the follow-up to that on a poster presentation would be, this is our method for inoperable tumors, is we block off their blood supply to be able to intentionally occlude the vessel. Notice how I used both phrases in there, blocking off the blood supply, and I said the word intentionally occluding the vessel. So there, you can kind of scaffold it that way if you have a mixed audience where you don't know. Shorten this a little bit. All right, so the idea is this, and this is my really practical tip. If you're like, but Emma, how do I do this for a publication? Here's my recommendation. Look at past published articles or abstracts. If that's, I mean, I'm picking these up because you need them to graduate, right? How do you get your PhD? You make a significant contribution to the field. I'm using quotes because that's not my phrase, that's somebody else's phrase, right? That's how largely universities define if you get to graduate or not with a PhD. How do you make a significant contribution? By publishing. So I keep coming back to that just because it's so necessary, but it's also really helpful for knowing what phrases to use. So I recommend look at what's come out of your lab specifically and see what the common denominators are. What shows up again and again, use that. If you're looking for a particular publication beyond your lab, but like say biomicrofluidics, lab on a chip, look at what phrases are used there and how do you include them and use an appropriate amount. Your PI can also potentially help with this. So could someone else in your lab, if you have a mentor or someone who started the project and you're their predecessor or their, follow-up person, they're your predecessor. The question to always ask is, what does your audience know or not? If they're a PhD in another field, will they know what that word is? And if not, maybe you'll need to add some scaffolding or support when you phrase it. So think about the next item that you're going to be producing, your next content piece. Just, we're going to only take 20 seconds for this, but I want you to think about it. Who is your audience? If you're publishing somewhere, what venue are you hoping to publish in? If you have a conference coming up, which one? Who's going to be there? Is it all scientists or just a particular field? Is it just the engineers at large or a subcategory? Think about that. So take just a moment, 20 seconds on the clock, and think about who's your audience. What will they know? What will they maybe not know? Go ahead and write that down. All right. Are there any questions on this part? I want to open that up to the group. And if you're taking a few more notes about your audience, that's okay. All right, here's the biggest takeaway. And if there's any questions, we can triage them as they come up. Here's the biggest takeaway though. And when I see errors in writing, this is often the error that everybody from the CEO to the inexperienced marketer, this is the problem that they have, which is they forget that they aren't their own audience and they write what they care about, what matters to them. Very human, right? We have our own experience, so we do this, it makes sense, but it's not helpful for successful writing. So I would encourage you to always remember you are not your audience. Let's see, if you're not exactly sure, is it better to guess that they are? Great question, Marina. Let me answer that right away and then we'll get into this. You're not your own audience. You won't always know exactly who your audience is. And that's why I'm recommending look at past things that have been successfully published in a particular place. So like with Lab on a Chip, you'd look up what phrases show up throughout the last couple versions of it, right? You have to read that anyway for your lit review, or in your lab, what's currently coming out of it, what phrases are used or not. And then it just depends, you know, if it's for an article in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, I would recommend more domain-specific vocabulary, but with the scaffolding explaining what it means. So don't just say we intentionally included the vessel. Well, actually, for an article in a publication like that, I would recommend you go more scientific. If it was the conference, I would add the scaffolding. If it was an investor, I would go less specialized. And then if they share that they are a specialist, then you could break out the domain-specific vocabulary. So you don't want to alienate them though. It's a balance, and with time, this will come more naturally on kind of what to do. But I would say abstracts or the articles themselves, very detailed, but you're still going to use that formula. So we're going to understand the relevance, what was done, what was missing, and why it matters. You'll just have a lot of those phrases in it as you're explaining it. The conference would be the middle ground, and then like an investor slide deck or an email or networking event, it would be more general. Unless you're with specialists, like where they have PhDs in your same field, like say a visiting lab or something, then maybe you could go more particular. Does that, it's hard to know without the actual audience to say it. Okay, cool. So here's the main deal though. Don't assume that you are your own audience, because you usually are not. So it is very rare where the audience is exactly going to care about the exact same things that you do. So I would always encourage you, ask yourself, who are they? What do they care about? What matters to them? And what words do they know? So for example, if they're a PhD in another field, they might not care about the specific material you used and like, oh my gosh, this is so much better. Like, I'm so excited. This was such a pain. The old material kept breaking and flaking and I had to redo experiments. Oh, what a headache. Your coworker in lab might care about that. The other researcher might just care like, well, but what's the research implication of this? And can we partner with my lab, right? Like they're going to care about something different, or the investor is going to care about the finances, but also the potential market or the impact of it. Your PI, likewise, they're wanting to know, are you successful on your steps towards something that's going to end up in publication? So if you say like, oh, we practiced doing 1,000 extra units last night, it was so cool. They might be excited about that if they're like, that's actually another publication topic. Or they might go, yeah, but okay, but how are you making progress towards publishing what we already talked about? So think about who your audience is and go from there. Here's my tip at the bottom. Most bad, meaning ineffective, writing forgets who the audience is, and the writer accidentally ends up writing for himself or herself. That's like the #1 problem that will happen. So that's why having your PI read it, having other people read it can be helpful, because they'll ask you some of those questions like, yeah, but why does that matter? Or, well, how is that important? And they can work with you on that. Any questions before we move to the next section here? Because we're going to practice this briefly before moving on to an abstract. So here's my example for you. 3 examples explaining the same research, but tailoring the writing to 3 different audiences. So the first person is your PI. The second is a 5th grader or an 8th grader, fine. And third is a science news magazine. So I'm showing you how I would tailor what I'm saying to each of those groups. So Marina, this will get into your question a little bit about how to tailor it. For a PI, I might say something like, our flow focusing microfluidic device creates clinical scale quantities of uniform fine droplets for gas embolotherapy. And the PI would be like, great, let's publish that. For the 5th grader, we would say, we built a device that produces a lot of really small droplets, enough that they can be used to help people with cancer. Right? You're probably never going like that general, but maybe. a science news magazine, which is probably how general you get. Oops. Oh my goodness. Sorry, guys. Went away. It's going the wrong direction on me. Here we go. The Science News magazine would be researchers designed a novel microfluidic device that can produce 1 million droplets a minute, the threshold needed for commercialization of the product to treat inoperable cancers or inoperable tumors. So notice how like the amount of domain specific vocabulary changes, but in each part we say, what did we find and why does it matter? And that's what we've been practicing on our earlier versions. So I just wanted you to see how to change it for each group. I would love to, in our last time here, give you a moment to just briefly, how would you do it for each of these audiences with your research? And maybe what you already wrote down in the voice to text in the earlier exercise was one of these, but I'm gonna go ahead and give you 2 minutes and just write one sentence for each of them. How would you say it? I'm gonna go ahead and give that to you on the clock. And if there's questions, you can ask in the comments right now. Go ahead and start. And if you haven't moved to the second option, go ahead and start writing for the second one. So whichever one you were working on, move on to the next one at this point, or even the third if you're there. Go ahead and finish up your thought on whichever one you're writing. Okay. So with these, hopefully this, even if you didn't have a complete sentence or if you were concerned over like the phrasing of it, hopefully at least it got your brain thinking about how do I change what I'm saying? Because none of these examples are for yourself, right? So hopefully it got your brain thinking a little bit about like, who are each of these people? What do they care about? And how would I tell it to them? And that really is the takeaway from this workshop, is how to write with confidence. And one of the ways to do that is to think about who your audience is and are you reaching them? This is a great exercise for accomplishing that, especially oscillating between the Science News magazine versus your PI. That can be helpful to think about the phrases that you'd use for each and how you'd share it. Any questions on this? I'll go ahead and go to the next one, but feel free to write a question if you have it. All right, so we had requested if you have your own abstract that you go ahead and pull it up now for your own writing. So this is the abstract that you're currently working on, however rough it is. And what I would like you to do, I'm going to give you a minute on the clock for this, but I would love for you to read through your abstract and label each of these parts. What is at stake? So why does it matter? You should have at least a sentence of that. If you don't, write in the margin, need variable A. What's currently being done? This is kind of like that lit review. So you can label that B if you want. What's currently missing? Like what's the gap, the unmet need that you're addressing? That definitely needs to be there. And how does what you found address that unmet need? And then what are the implications? So go ahead and take a minute and see, do you have A, B, C, D, and E for if we're making them letters? Go ahead and label those on your own. If you're missing something, make a note tonight to write it down. Go ahead and start on that. Read through your own abstract and do a moment of self-editing. I'll go ahead and give you a minute now. If they're not in order, that's okay. For the actual abstract, you put them in this order, but just notice where they happen if they're not in order right now. And if you're missing any of these variables, please make a note to yourself this evening to find what they are and to write them down. So what's currently done, if you don't know, that would be the lit review. So that's maybe you want to outsource and look through past articles from your lab. But for the other things, hopefully you're able to answer those for yourself, but you might need to write them down if they're not there yet. Are there any questions on this before we move on to an example one? Okay. So here's what I wanted to do as a group is looking through this case study together. This is an abstract that was submitted. It's a working draft. I'm not expecting any of you to know anything about this topic prior to reading it. What I would like you to do is I'm going to read it out loud. And as I'm reading, I would like you to look for, do they have all those parts of the equation? What the topic is, what's currently done, what's missing, how what they do fills that gap, and why it matters. As I'm reading through, let's look for that. And are any parts to domain specific? So I'm going to read it out loud and feel free to make note in the side for that. Or actually, let me rephrase that. Let's stop after each sentence together and we can say what it is for the sake of time. So the opening sentence is, binding free energy calculations are quickly becoming an integral part of the drug discovery process in most pharmaceutical companies. Any idea what variable that might relate to or what topic based on the formula? Great. Yeah. So it is a combination of this, right? What's at stake? It's a little bit like the opening, like this is a key interest area. It's also a little bit about what's being done. It's unclear though. And so I would recommend, first of all, whoever wrote this, great job on not jumping in with just what you found. That's the impulse and you resisted. So really good job. To make this an even stronger opening, I would recommend that they add in some of the topic and kind of what's at stake so we have buy-in. So maybe that's something like the drug discovery process currently takes 9 months to go from ideation to commercialization. Something where like it builds like, why does this matter? What's the problem? And then maybe this sentence is part of what is currently done. So that's what I would edit on this. So the next sentence says, traditional relative binding free energy approaches are most commonly used, but they have the limitation of only being able to handle congenic series of ligands that share a common scaffold with minor differences. What sentence do we think that is? Or what variable is that? And it might be a combo, this sentence right here. Oh. Yes. Okay, good. Serena, yes, it's both the current protocols and gaps, and whoever labeled gap, yes, right? So we have, but they have the limitation of, that's our key phrase of ding, 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 this is the gap, right? So this person combined it. It's okay to combine it in 2 sentences or in a sentence, but we want it really clear what's currently done. So I would maybe even expand that. So if this is your abstract, I might say something like a whole sentence on current standards include X, Y, Z, P, and Q. However, relative binding free energy has the limitation of, so we understand the gap clearly, right? We can really set it up specifically. Here's the topic, here's what's done, here's what's missing, and then we can go into the next part, right? And the next sentence says, ligand transformations that involve ring breaking information have historically been very challenging for traditional approaches, but our lab, right? So this first part is kind of the gap or the problem, but our lab developed a binding free energy method that we believe can handle these variable types of transformations. That's a little bit the finding, right? This method is called separated topology, and it's an approach that performs two absolute binding calculations in opposite directions, which removes da 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 da, and it can be applied to this, unlike traditional methods. What is that area doing, or what variable is that? What they found, right? So this is the findings section. This is the findings. So it's what they discovered that they can do. The implications, you're right, it does start saying a little bit about what they can do. Really, for the findings, we want to say exactly what they found, and they do get to that later. This next paragraph says, in the study, we use this benchmark for this to test challenging this. Ultimately, we wanted to, and it says what they found. It's a little out of order, right? This part should maybe come first, and then the implications would come after, or transition. But ultimately, that part all would be shortened to make this whole thing a smaller abstract. And we need a little bit more of variable A and B. What's the topic? What is currently done? And why is that a problem? So when we get to these parts, it makes sense why they did this and why it's going to matter for future research. This is actually mostly in the right order, right? How they did things. It's just how long they talk about each thing that could be adjusted. And you're right on the implications part being here and being able to move down. So for that, sorry, I'm trying to move to the next slide here. The point of pulling this one up is just to show, when you're reading your own abstract, really notice, is what you have in the right order? And do you need to expand any of it? Is there stuff that should be talked about more or spoken about more clearly, so really understand each of those variables, what they are and why it matters? With that, I would like to transition to an opportunity for questions at the end here, where you can ask things about your own writing. Ooh, great question for Jillian here. So let's move on to the question and answer part, and Julian, I can answer this for you. So do you spend equal time on each of these sections? No. And if you're asking how much to spend on each, my recommendation would be read abstracts that have been published recently in the publication you're looking to submit to, and follow suit. In general, why it matters is a sentence. What's currently done is a sentence or two. The gap is one sentence. Your findings are going to be probably 2 sentences or 3, and then the implication after, and then you get out. Those abstracts are very short. Great question, Zach here. He says, can you explain what the ideal first sentence of an abstract should be? I find that people typically list a general fact of the field to walk readers into the work, though this sometimes seems unnecessary, but in the example you gave, it seems to be our first sentence should be the problem in a way. Yeah, so the opener should be something that we understand, like, why is this relevant? Why does this matter? Like, why is this a topic of research right now? So it can be a hook, and the example, or excuse me, the accompanying text that we're raffling off has some ideas about how to do this. Part of it is a personal preference on how people would like to do it. But I would really recommend, to be successful, if the definition of success is being published, I would look at, how does your publication of choice, like your number one where you want to get it published there, how do they typically treat that opening sentence? But it's something that should point to the problem. That way it flows. It shouldn't be an irrelevant but slightly related fact. It should really drive to, like, what's going on, what's currently done, what's missing with what's done, and how does what you do address that? It should holistically help that flow. So pick an opening sentence that will reflect that. Follow-up questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap up here. I'll give everyone just 1 minute to, if there's any final questions here before I turn it over to Joanne. I just wanted to say it was a pleasure to work with all of you today. I hope that you're leaving this workshop feeling really empowered on how to leverage that formula to know what you want to say, who you want to say it to, and that you feel you have some really practical tools in your writing kit for when you sit down to write something, being able to get it on the page and get it on a page in a way that will matter and ultimately get you published. If you have any questions, I'm happy if Joanne would like to share my email with anybody. And it was really lovely to work with all of you. You're welcome. Thanks so much, you guys.